If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. What does this mean? It seems obvious, simple, and straightforward. Jesus directs the invitation not just to the disciples, but also to the crowd. This is not a word for the elite few. It's a word for all. Following Jesus is not a glory ride or access ramp to worldly success. True sense of self comes through denial of self-interest. Playing it safe means losing life. Risking means gaining life in fullness. Before we go too far, it behooves me this morning to say what denying oneself and taking up one's cross does not mean. This is not an invitation to pacification for submission's sake. Unfortunately, the church and individual believers have misused and misconstrued this text to keep certain people in their place, especially women. How much unfortunate misinterpretation has come from using this verse and patting people on the head to say we all have our crosses to bear. Let's be clear. The invitation to take up the cross should never be misused to perpetuate oppression, tolerate oppression, or keep people in their place. Jesus' call here has nothing to do with the legitimization of pain and suffering. He spent much of his earthly ministry in time and effort to address human suffering of all kinds. For the chief end of taking up the cross is to receive life, abundant life, in the midst of all that seeks to destroy life. Taking up the cross and denying self comes about for the sake of the gospel. We must also say here this morning that this text does not call for us to fabricate some fancy form of persecution complex in order to live this passage out. Oh yes, the church in severely conflicted parts of the world continues to produce its martyrs. Right now, as we speak, Christians have been kidnapped, tortured, and killed in places like Niger, Egypt, and Pakistan. But many scholars believe that Mark's gospel was written for the encouragement of an early Christian community that was persecuted, or at least carried a vivid enough memory of past persecution. We certainly don't live in the old Christendom days, but most of us sitting here today would not lose our job or life on the spot simply for being a Christian in this context. After having said what Christ's words do not mean, there are many ways in which the gospel does call us to deny self and take up the cross daily in order to be formed together into Christ. We should consider today whether there are situations in our daily lives in which public pressure might lead us to deny our faith in small ways. Many of us know that Christian faith is not always welcome in the workplace. So we learn to cloak our Christian identity when morally questionable business practices seem to take over the day. Children and youth feel the pinch too. We're almost close to spring when the whole explosion of sports will break out. Coaches sometimes threaten to cut out game time, playing time, if their players insist on attending worship or confirmation class when they conflict with practice. There are many situations in which public pressure may lure us into denying the faith or carrying a lighter cross than the Gospels. I am mindful of the insidious practical atheism that shows indifference to God's loving plan to restore the world. Most of us are tempted by that more than anything else, to not be aware of God's presence throughout our lives. In her book, "And the Trees Clapped Their Hands," Virginia Owens writes about the way spies become like the people around them. The spy slowly begins to forget his mission. He spends too much time and effort learning the language, adopting the habits and customs, internalizing the thought patterns flawlessly, that somehow, gradually, the spy becomes his cover. Most of us who claim to follow Christ consciously or unconsciously learn strategies to fit in. Even in a society that is not always blatantly hostile to the faith, there is something about taking up the cross and denying oneself for the sake of the gospel that goes against the grain of much that we cherish and value. I have a friend who's a teenager, junior in high school, lives in my neighborhood, and she's a rather feisty and defiant gal. And she's a committed Christian. And she says, "Mr. Whitener, I like to go upstream." To live as a Christian in our world is to go upstream. Brothers and sisters, I guess the question and challenge boils down to this morning. What to you is of such ultimate value that it is truly worth risking your own life and reputation for? What do you consider so essential to your life that you will stand up for it at all costs? For Jesus Christ, that very thing was the powerful gospel of saving love. Love for you and me, love stronger than sin and death and the power of the evil one. So precious was this mission for Jesus that it was his life. To affirm this life of radical love for the world, he gave up everything. He denied all self-interest. He shirked all false securities, defenses, and worldly comforts. He took up the heavy cross, a tree of death, in order to attach us all to the living branch of eternal life. We cannot even begin to take up the cross until our hearts stir with this promise. The one who demands our all gave his all for the sake of this gospel of conquering love. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Now, it is not my job to determine or legislate what following Christ and taking up the cross means and looks like for you. It's seldom a literal life or death matter, but it impacts many of our daily decisions. The great preacher, Fred Craddock, framed the meaning of discipleship with this financial analogy. This is what he says. We think giving our all to the Lord is like taking a $1,000 bill and laying it down on the table. Here's my life, Lord. But the reality for most of us is that he sends us to the bank and has us cash in the $1,000 for quarters. We go through life putting out 25 cents here and 50 cents there and 75 cents there. Usually giving our life to Christ isn't glorious or dramatic. It's done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time. Taking up the cross and denying self-interest takes shape in many and various ways. Worshiping the Lord God in a world entertained to death, turning the other cheek and giving away that extra coat, taking the high road knowing the low road offers greater emotional satisfaction, spending time with people who seem to have nothing to offer you, emptying bedpans and dressing wounds, listening to a lonely person as if she is the only person in the world, raising children, loving parents, embracing neighbors during a snowstorm, hanging out with folks missing from the nation's networks of care and concern. Taking up the cross little by little, step by step, day by day. That's the way. Both difficult and joy-filled, sacrificing self-interest for the sake of the gospel's wider and deeper movement, engaging in the struggle for the neighbor's well-being. There is no other way worthy of our complete investment than getting behind and following Jesus in our daily lives. Amen.
Amen.